Um, the language question for Ambedkar actually posed various aspects. If you contextualize Ambedkar in the larger discourse on language question in 20th century modern India, during the time of the freedom struggle, it's also interesting to see how Ambedkar engages and reflects and interrogates the given category of language along with others, for example, Gandhi and Nehru particularly. I don't have time to go into detail of it, but it is something which is worth probing. What I want to begin with, because I have very limited time and won't be able to go into detail of many of the aspects that I think are very interesting in Ambedkar's writings, even though much of the work on Ambedkar has been with respect to the minority issue, with respect to the caste question, but I think the language question has been overlooked in Ambedkar's writings, and it's only in the past 1 decade or maybe decade and a half that his scholars have been thinking through his writings on language. Once again, it's not so much on language per se, a category which is very elusive to many of the thinkers, at least nationalist thinkers of that time, but it then goes actually in a much more pragmatic administrative use of a language through reorganization. So it's not that Ambedkar didn't think about language as an abstract science system. He did, but he was much more rational about his conceptualization of the understanding of language in India. So I'll come to that in a little while, but let me just pose the two issues which I think, or rather three, which I think are central to Ambedkar's writings on language question that I call, but actually they are mostly on reorganization, as Professor Pai said, and on the idea of checks and balances of majorities and minorities in new states or older states. One, I think it was very clear to Ambedkar, like many other nationalists of that time, that in a multicultural, multilingual country such as India, politicization of the language question is going to be a very, very symbolic issue. I'm not suggesting that Ambedkar politicized the language, but he knew the political relevance of the language question from the beginning. Second point that I want to flag off is that for him, the idea of homogeneity, or a rather national homogeneity, which comes out very, very clearly in his writings, is also very important. And he worries a lot about this whole issue of homogeneity and heterogeneity. A great deal in these essays, actually the 4 sets of writings that I have looked at to engage with Ambedkar on the language question. And thirdly, the whole question of minority, but it's not simply a numerical question for him, majority versus minority, but minorities in terms of their claims for citizenship. So you can also see Ambedkar reflecting, writing, thinking a lot about the idea of minority citizenship. So these are the 3, I think, issues which come up again and again when you read Ambedkar's writings. So what I have done, I have taken 4 writings of Ambedkar for today's presentation. One is his work called States and Minorities. What are their rights and how to secure them in the Constitution of Free India. Second work is titled Need for Checks and Balances, Articles on Linguistic States. Third one is Thoughts on the Linguistic States, that he published just before the reorganization, during the time of the reorganization State Commission. And fourth one, on which he actually was quite attached to the subject of Maharashtra as a linguistic province. Let me start. I don't want to just speak thinking through, but I have written something. It will save my time and also make me more coherent. Ambedkar's critical observations and concerns for the minorities in the newly constituted states after independence, and his erudite, judicious and pragmatic approach to the question of multilingual social heterogeneity within the federal state structure provide a kind of blueprint for the political formation of the Indian state and its constituents. Unfortunately, Ambedkar's writings on the language question have not received much attention despite the emergence of vast scholarship centered on Ambedkar's own writings in the last 3 decades. Ambedkar differed from Gandhi, Nehru, and several other nationalists over the language question. He often contested the Congress Party's ideology of linguistic nationalism during the years of 1920 to 40. What guided Ambedkar in his call for linguistic states was his predominant concern for the unity and integrity of the country immediately after the partition. In order to understand Ambedkar's proposals for the linguistic states, along with his deep-seated fears and apprehensions in creating them, it is helpful to ask the following questions. 1. How did Ambedkar resolve the tension between minority languages and their decisive inclusion or exclusion in determining the linguistic composition of a state? This is something that he keeps coming back to over and over again. Didn't he too, like Gandhi and Congress, who were willing to recognize Muslims, Christians, and Sikhs as distinct communities, want untouchables in his language to be treated a distinct cultural community? If so, how did he define the linguistic cultural identity? Ambedkar's emphasis on the just political order within the framework of the constitutional democracy ensures certain requisite safeguards for cultural and linguistic minorities. He does want to reconcile the tension between cultural pluralism and political democracy, as well as between social heterogeneity, that is multilingualism, and political authority, that is federalism. For Ambedkar, cultural specificity and social plurality can coexist with a democratic polity insofar as, quote, democracy is to function properly, the subjects of the state must be so distributed as to form a single homogeneous group. Each province must be homogeneous in its population if democracy in the province is to be successful. End of quote. So you can see how Ambedkar is linking democracy with certain degree of homogeneity. Ambedkar consistently argued that the proposed linguistic states would become socially more homogeneous and politically democratic in due course of time. Languages appear to perform the task of bringing in the equality of democratic citizenship in Ambedkar's vision. However, the focus on the conflict between linguistic majority and minority communities remains underemphasized in his characterization of the linguistic states, which in the last 50 years have been overburdened with the problem of linguistic minorities. So, in these 4 set of writings that earlier referred to, Ambedkar compiled detailed notes and tables about the scheduled caste population in all states and its numerical minority status to other communities then existing. It was a memorandum regarding the safeguards for scheduled caste submitted to the Constituent Assembly on behalf of the All India Scheduled Caste Federation in 1947. The memorandum listed and defined several fundamental rights, minority rights, and safeguards for the scheduled caste in general. In order to emphasize the need for special protection and representation of the scheduled caste, Ambedkar in this memorandum elaborated upon the articles as they were supposed to be part of the Constitution of India, then in the making. He suggested that the Constituent Assembly had to face 2 difficult problems at that time. One, the problem of minorities, and the reorganization of the Indian states. Regarding the latter, Ambedkar had wished to be elected as a member of the States Committee for his interests pertaining to the reorganization and reconstitution of states in independent India, but as we know, unfortunately, he was not made a member of either the Dhar Commission or the JVP Committee, both of which were set up to consider proposals for the linguistic reorganization of the states soon after independence. And in spite of this, he continued to express and explain his views on this question through his numerous writings written during the decade of 1940 and 50. Ambedkar consistently argued that the proposed linguistic states would become socially more homogeneous and politically democratic in due course of time. His proposals about the formation of the linguistic states emanated from his democratic impulse to accord political and cultural recognition to the term region, otherwise defined predominantly in a geographical spatial sense. He gave importance to the term, gave importance to the size of the population of a state and suggested the creation of the present day Uttaranchal, Jharkhand and Chhattisgarh in his own writings at that time. He wanted Bombay to be a separate city-state, while Maharashtra would remain representative of Gujaratis and Marathas. The idea of one state, one language that he defended over one language, one state, which I think was a very radical proposal. Otherwise, it would have been a total chaos if one had to divide the boundaries of the states following the number of languages spoken in this country. So one state, one language was predominantly guided by his quest for development, justice, equality and freedom for the untouchables and Dalits who would perhaps learn the language of the new state and participate in its political and administrative affairs. He also noted that linguistic states would only lead to consolidation, and I think he keeps emphasizing on this fact, which we need to remind ourselves over and over again, even in our own time, how the reorganization or the creation of linguistic states would actually lead to the consolidation of the upper castes, jeopardizing the interests of the scheduled caste. Ambedkar, while addressing the Constituent Assembly on January 26, 1950, said, and I quote him, "We are going to enter a life of contradictions. In politics, we have equality, and in social and economic life, we will have inequality. We must remove this contradiction at the earliest possible moment, or else those who suffer inequality will blow up the structure of political democracy, which this assembly has so laboriously built up." Since Ambedkar's writings on the language question are actually more about the reorganization or about the creation of linguistic states, I'm just going to talk a little bit about it, how he actually envisioned about this idea and how he thought of sort of pragmatically pursuing it in his own lifetime. Ambedkar thought that the demand for the creation of linguistic province was primarily based on the idea of nationality, defined in terms of the differences of languages and cultures among people of different regions. For him, any reorganization of states in India on the linguistic basis has to be accommodated within the broader framework of the federal structure of the government. So he was very particular about the federal principles. He alerts us to the dangerous separatist tendencies that could potentially inhere in the creation of nations and nationalities founded on the basis of race and language exclusively, without a certain degree of rationale for political progress and development. And the second important aspect that Ambedkar emphasizes while considering the proposal for linguistic states is to ensure that there is one language of communication between the center and the states. And he's very, very firm about this position. This could be possible, he argued, only if the provincial language of each province does not come in the way of the official language of the central government, while establishing communicative and administrative order with each of its provinces. Such an arrangement, he hoped, might avert an unwarranted surge towards linguistic nationalism spurred on by the dominant linguistic communities, which would be like to enthrone their own respective languages as the languages of rule and control at the center. So he could envision how the language can also become an oppressive form of an oppression. In this case, Ambedkar suggested that the central government will have to communicate in as many languages as there are linguistic provinces. What this entailed was that provincial languages should not be made official languages of the linguistic provinces, but still be considered part of the governmental and administrative rationality only if the center decided to communicate with them at the provincial level. He justified his objection to the language of the province being made its official language on the assumption that, I quote him, linguistic province has nothing to do with the question of what should be its official language, or that, quote, language has to play the part only in terms of the demarcation of the boundaries of the province, end of quote. According to him, danger lies in creating linguistic provinces with the language of each province as its official language. The latter would lead to the creation of provincial nationalities, he calls it, for the use of the provincial languages as official languages would lead provincial cultures to be isolated, crystallized, hardened, and solidified, end of quote. In one of his four sort of works that I have earlier referred to, he says, history shows that democracy cannot work in a state where the population is not homogeneous. That's where he's arguing about homogeneity as a principle, as a guiding principle. In a heterogeneous population divided into groups which are hostile and antisocial towards one another, the working of democracy is bound to give rise to cases of discrimination, neglect, partiality, suppression of the interests of one group at the hands of another group, which happens to capture political power. The reason why in a heterogeneous society, Ambedkar says, democracy cannot succeed is because power, instead of being used impartially and on merits and for the benefit of all, is used for the aggrandizement of one group and to the detriment of another. On the other hand, a state which is homogeneous in its population can work for the true ends of democracy, for there are no artificial barriers or social antipathies which lead to the misuse of political power. Now, it's quite, this whole issue of homogeneity versus heterogeneity in our time actually poses different sets of questions. But for Ambedkar in the 1950s, I think like Nehru, he was worried that there might be more than one partition if we go on following the criteria of language as the only criteria for dividing the states. In a pamphlet called Needs for Checks and Balances, Articles on Linguistic States, Ambedkar expressed his thought over the linguistic states, again at a time when the demand for the creation of linguistic states had already been made more vociferously by several states, and the government had decided to constitute a States Reorganization Commission to put these demands into some kind of a rational order. As a chairman of the drafting committee of the Constitution, Ambedkar gave particular attention to the demand in the formative years of 1947 to 53. He saw how the demand for the creation of Andhra Pradesh had culminated violently in the self-immolation of Poti Shiramalu that forced Nehru to concede to the creation of Andhra Pradesh. I'm going to skip some sections because I think I don't have time. Let me just read out a few important quotes that I have put in the paper from Ambedkar's own works, just to draw attention to what he was thinking. He says, in a linguistic state, what would remain for the smaller communities to look to? Can they hope to be elected to the legislature? Can they hope to maintain a place in the state service? His larger piece titled Thoughts on the Linguistic State, which was published just before the reorganization, is something which is, I think, worth looking into. I don't have time to go into it, but he was quite critical of Congress Party's policy on the linguistic states, which was actually following Gandhi's earlier idea of the PCC, reorganized on the idea of language. And for Ambedkar, of course, Maharashtra was a testing ground. And what thoughts did he have about Maharashtra? It's very instructive to see what he thought about Maharashtra, not simply in terms of Maratha identity versus Gujarati identity, but he had something much more. In this pamphlet that he wrote, Maharashtra as a Linguistic Province, what he suggests is that he proposes that Maharashtra could be reconstituted as a linguistically homogeneous state, apart from 4 or 5 very important factors that he kept drawing attention to in all these 4 set of writings. For example, the idea of financial viability, geographical and cultural contiguity. He pointed out that Maharashtra should be a unified province. In this case, the main contentious area was the city of Bombay, which had become controversial by the time Ambedkar started reflecting and proposing the changes in the territorial composition of the state of Maharashtra. And as Professor Pai was suggesting that he was in favor of dividing Maharashtra into 4 different states to retain this whole principle of homogeneity and also to think about the fate of the minorities. Since I have to conclude, let me just say towards the very end that Ambedkar consistently argued that the proposed linguistic states would become socially more homogeneous and politically democratic in due course of time. His proposals about the formation of linguistic states emanated from his democratic impulse. He also, in some way, suggested that he has written quite a lot about the fate of Hindi, about English, about provincial languages and so on and so forth, about the idea of majority and minority linguistically defined, and towards the end he seems to suggest that the linguistic provinces must necessarily deal with the problems arising out of tension between regional and national languages and their role in the administration, education, economy, culture of the society. And finally, the demand for linguistic states needs to be contextualized within the logic of capitalist mode of production and economy, which radically alters the existing economic and political relations among people and communities. I think this is one aspect we do not think about, but Ambedkar, being an economist and who actually wrote so much about it, he also tried to set up the relationship between political economy and the language. And the two categories were so very difficult to unpack, and particularly the relationship. And therefore, when he talks about the logic of capitalist production, that needs to be unraveled. Unilingual states facilitate and bind the communicative order and relations among the bourgeois classes of different regions and states in a manner that the class hegemony and linguistic domination coalesce. And I think this idea you can see Ambedkar working through it in a very subtle way in these writings. Ambedkar could have anticipated the conflict between developed and underdeveloped regions growing deeper and more complicated within his problematic of the linguistic states. I would stop here, but the point I was trying to make was that it's not fair maybe just to reduce Ambedkar's writings on this particular aspect to the idea of linguistic states or reorganization of states, because Ambedkar, as he was a erudite scholar and he was well versed with the subjects like economics and had reflected on many other issues, he was also responding. His writings were a response to the way in which the language question in the 1920s and 40s was taking shape, particularly the communalization of the language question, and he was also in a way responding to Gandhi's very imaginary, emotive, romantic idea of a language. Unlike Nehru, who actually had thought like a pragmatic statesman, who wanted to use language in a somewhat, in a manner in which it had acquired a certain kind of pragmatic form. So Ambedkar seems to be in dialogue, in a conversation, in interaction with many other nationalists of his time, and we read Ambedkar's writings on the language question only exclusively in terms of the reorganization and linguistic states, which I think we need to also extend his reflections beyond it. Thank you.